Hey, 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 everybody, welcome.
Welcome.
We are excited to have a little tag team with me and John tonight. Gonna talk about strategies, talk about learning, studying, all those good things. Some of you have been here before. We had one of these 2 weeks ago, I think, or maybe it was last week.
It was last week.
Last week. And that was the introduction in terms of learning and memory. And this is going to be phase 2 of 3. This will be optimizing, studying, and learning. Let's do some introductions. Jed Appleruth, been doing this for 20 years. Got a background in ed psychology, science of learning, how the brain holds things in, how to retrieve things, how to optimize studying, and always enjoy sharing insights and knowledge that we've earned over the years here at Appleruth, and also through the academic lens also. And John.
Hi, my name is John Cadenhead. I'm the Senior Director of Tutor Services here at Appleruth. So my job is training and managing tutors, making sure that we have the best skills, the best curriculum out there, and that we know what we're doing, and we continue to grow and find the stuff that we need to be the best. So along with that, I have a master's in teaching, and I do a whole lot of executive functioning coaching as well. And so looking particularly at the big picture of like, how do I continue to grow and be the best that I can be in the school, in the classroom, as I, go through the adolescent period of high school and middle school and into college and all those pieces of the puzzle. So Jed and I are excited to talk to you guys about how to shine bright at school and the fun of that side of the world.
All right, well, let's jump in.
All right, do we want to dive in with the poll?
Yeah, why don't we do that? We've been starting off all of these with a quick, easy poll. 2 questions. I'm a parent, student educator, and then if you're a parent, what year do you have a senior, a junior, or sophomore? Just get a sense of who we are and how to be the most helpful to y'all. All right, and that's it. Takes 2 clicks and close it out, and off we go.
All right, thank you guys. Let me get the buttons all clicking in the right spot. Cool. So as we dive into today's presentation, I want us to start thinking, like I mentioned earlier, about like, how do I learn to be a better learner long-term, whether that be myself as a student, myself as a parent trying to help my student, right? If I'm coming in from whatever background I'm coming from, how do I continue that growth process? And a lot of that is recognizing that we don't retain things perfectly in our heads right away. And so how can we not fall into that route? The good news is that you're going to get this PowerPoint. You don't have to worry about writing down everything we're talking about tonight. You get to see it all over again. We're recording this, all those fun pieces of the puzzle. But what I would encourage you to do is to grab some paper, grab a pencil, practice taking notes. And your goal in taking notes is not just write down everything I'm saying right now or what Jed says in a few minutes, but it is instead to try to turn it into your own thoughts. What is the key takeaway in your brain, in your words, in your language, to help you retain it? Because the more you can practice that skill set, the better off you're going to be long-term trying to take whatever information it is, either in like the office, in the classroom, studying on your own, watching a movie. No one takes notes when they're watching a movie, just me. But however it is, right? All right, so as we dive in, we've got 3 main goals for today. We're going to talk a big picture of how learning works. Jed's going to deep dive the brain and the processes there. We're going to look at key strategies, specific things that you can do to become a better learner, to become a master learner, with your school, whether at home, however you are with that process. And then we're going to figure out how to build that commitment process between the parent and the student, because that also is half of the battle of like, we have to work together. We both care that the student becomes the best that they can be, but also we recognize that I don't think anyone has ever had the perfect relationship of a 17-year-old and a parent together at any point in time. So how do we mitigate that and build a bond and a commitment together? So let's dive in and have some fun. So Jed,
thank you, John. So the first section of tonight is going to be talking about just the general foundations of learning. And this is really important because if students understand this, and as parents, you're watching this, supporting your students, if you understand this, it really helps make things easier. Over the 20 years I've been working with kids, and even before that, when I did AmeriCorps and teaching, there are a lot of people who mean very well and they have the right intentions, motivations, but the skills they're bringing to bear, the way they're trying to learn, and study, it's incredibly suboptimal. Their strategies are very ineffective, and no one's ever taken them aside and actually paused, like, where did you learn how to study? Where did you learn how to learn? Where did you learn how to review material, how to memorize things, how to, how to be really thoughtful? And often, they may pull from, I saw my sibling doing this, or my parent doing this, or someone else. But typically, there's not someone who's giving them, this is the absolute best way for you to learn. There are many teachers who are masterful in the content areas. They know calculus, they know history, they know this piece. But in terms of the psychology of how learning takes place, rarely is that given to students. And John and I both believe this should be a required class in middle school or in high school or in college. So you really go in there, and every hour you put into studying and learning, it's going to be a smart hour and a thoughtful hour, and the right way to do it, versus just let me try harder using techniques that are really ineffective by themselves. So it might take me 7 hours, and I could spend 3 and actually get it more effectively. So, but how we learn, it's a very active process. It's a developmental process. It takes place throughout the lifespan and never stops until we die. Learning is ongoing. We now have evidence just how plastic the brain is. And John and I both have small kids, and we get to watch them constantly learning, blowing through new things, new ideas. It's amazing when you have kids under 10. Just have the pace and the speed of new skills. My daughter's a year and a half, and even just new words every day. Tonight, my wife and I looked at each other like a brand new thing, which she got so perfectly. It's like, that wasn't there yesterday. And so suddenly these new things are lining up. And so learning, again, it's constant. And as we learn, the brain is a giant network of information and neurons, starting off with 100 billion neurons. And over time, the brain's trying to figure out which ones are important, which ones are meaningful, which little pieces of memory we're going to have to recall and retrieve later, therefore they're more meaningful, which ones aren't important. And actually, there's a big paring down. Like right now, my daughter is all neurons, and it's just a massive, huge mess of white matter, and in there. And in the grand scheme, a lot of those neurons are going to get pruned down. And when she's about 7, there's this massive neural pruning when all the stuff that's not being utilized on a regular basis gets reduced. So the brain gets more efficient. It's all about starting off with masses of possibilities. As we get older, we're narrowing, so things become more efficient. And that's part of the networking capacity of the brain. And so the brain's always trying to be effective and efficient, and which things matter. And part of learning is giving the brain a signal, this matters, telling it this matters, through repetition and reinforcement and attention, that we actually control and regulate to some capacity what our brain remembers and what it forgets. And so whenever, how does learning happen? On a very simple, the Atkinson-Shiffrin model of memory, how it works, you have sensory input coming into the cortex. So we have, the optic nerve giving signals to the back of the brain, giving us information visually. We have auditory processing, we have sounds coming in, things we're seeing, words coming in. And then we're going to hold things ever so briefly in this momentary store called, short-term memory, working memory. And this thing decays very quickly without reinforcement. And the whole thing is, because so much of what you see, you're watching, birds fly, things happen, there's input coming at you constantly, but most of it you ignore. We're getting so many messages, the way your chair feels. You're going to forget that in seconds. The way that the current temperature of the room, all these things, that the light in the room, you'll forget all this within a matter of minutes, if it's not much faster. But the whole thing is, for learning, if I want to be able to retain this and recall it and use it later, I have to interact with it. Otherwise, it's evanescent, it's ephemeral, it's momentary, bam, and then gone. Sensory register feels it, and then it goes away. So the name of the game is encoding. How do we put information into longer-term memory? How do we encode it into long-term memory so it sticks? So we can actually access it later on when it's needed. And that is a process, and students can get much more involved with learning how to encode more effectively for later, for transfer, for other things. All right, next slide, please. So again, we mentioned most memories, they're incredibly fragile. Things are in and out, things fire for a moment, but then it's not important for long-term. And part of it, our brains were designed to forget. And thank God we forget, because if we didn't forget, it would be a mess. And people who are really, really unhealthy and unhappy don't forget. And there's all this memory research, people who have impeccable, perfect memories Often they're the ones who have PTSD and those traumatic memories, and they're just encoded perfectly, and they don't change over time. Most memories are shifting, they're changing, things are rewiring. But when we don't forget anything, it's actually pathological. It's very unhealthy. We need to forget things to save room for what's really important and meaningful. And also for old slights, old hurts, old injuries and wounds. Thankfully, looking back at our past, we do tend to gloss over those rosy colored glasses, which is really adaptive and healthy psychologically. So forgetting is really good for us, but remembering is also really important. And part of it is learning, how do I remember things better? How do I take information, put it into memory in a way that it's going to stick and consolidate and interact with other memories and lodge in there. And then I'm going to be able to use it and pull from it later on down the road. So next slide. So again, there's a real thing of choice and agency and decision-making about this matters to me, telling the brain this matters. And in part of encoding that matters, it's not people who have relatively short working memory spans. They do something, I've seen students do this, and many of you have too, where they just repeat it again and again. It's called phonological repetition. And that's one of the absolute worst ways, is keep pinging it without laying down some deeper connection to other information that a more meaningful way to understand it. Just saying it again isn't nearly as good as really trying to grasp the essence and how it fits with other things that Because again, if things don't lodge in with other aspects, they're going to just kind of bounce off. That's one of the reasons why people who, have prior exposure to a concept, like they did a camp this summer for computer science, programming, and they go into a class for AP computer science, and so much more sticks for them than someone who's going in cold, because there's a foundation laid to hold things where someone has no context. So context matters a lot. And it's part of it, it's way more effective, more important to do one deep round of encoding, making sure I get things, understand things, versus repeating it 15 times without really understanding it. Next slide. So one of the giants in memory research was Herman Ebbinghaus, and he was 100 years ago. He was fast, back before science was done with the current way with our PhDs and doctorates. Some person with an interest in how does my memory work, and he created a system of using nonsense syllables. And he said, what if I learn these series of nonsense syllables that have no meaning or context, and then I try to memorize them and see how long I retain the memory. And one of Ebbinghaus's major insights was that what really, really matters is not the length of repetition, of review and study, but the number of intervals, of having time between intervals, and then things lock in much, much, much longer into long-term memory. And so if I see it once, even for like 3 hours, that memory is going to decay pretty quickly. Within 3 days, the things are dropping off. Within a week, things are dropped dramatically off. However, if I see the information, then I see it again the next day. Then I wait 2 days and see it on the third or fourth day. That information, I've given my brain a signal, this really matters. And part of it has to do with, the neurons are firing. And, neurons, we've heard this before, when neurons fire together, boom, boom, it's chemical, and, it crosses that, the synapse, they begin to lock together when there's more of these firing patterns. So one long 3-hour block of just things activated isn't nearly as good as it fires for a little bit. I come back to it the next day, there's again, come back a couple more days. And these synapses get stronger and stronger. It's like, oh, these things are really linked, and you've had to retrieve and recall information several times. This must be important. Let's hold this for later. And you have a stronger synapse. There's more neurotransmitter going across, more receptors that bind them together. So, and there's research from Ebbinghaus that's now dated, but his research has been replicated and updated. And then the same thing, when you break things up and study with, you have interference, that you learn something, you put it away, come back to it, put it away, that's way more powerful than just one big block. And so, and we still have a sense that it's pretty, interesting how much is retained over time. But this note, we work with our kids and we tell them, like, don't do a 3-hour session. I want you to do 30 minutes here, 30 minutes here, 30 minutes here, break things up over multiple days. And you're telling your brain, this counts, this matters. Next slide. And then there are certain ways that the brain holds information better. Before, we had written language, we had stories. We've been holding our information in narrative form with structure and form, way long before we've had, logical written language. That's relatively new for our species. With, cuneiform, other things, recounting, and then words. We've had stories forever. So we hold stories better. And humans are story machines. We love making stories. You give us 5 pieces of unrelated information, and we're going to make some meaning of it. We're going to start connecting things. So the brain likes a flow of things and things being connected. So part of it is telling stories is also a way to make things stick for longer than just disparate random facts. Again, it's all these connections make things hold together in long-term memory. So we have concept maps. This ties to this goes over here, history, other things, biology, but making things link together and chaining things. And there's a word called chunking. Chunking things, locking them together is really a great way to make things stick versus learning things in isolation. So chunking is also a really powerful technique and so forth. Next slide. And so interference matters. And there's interference, so I mentioned before the idea of like doing a really long 3-hour session. And part of it is when you start packing in information, the brain can only hold so much in one learning session. And there is a focus, the brain tends to remember very vividly what's first, it's called primacy, and then what's last called recency. So what you learn at the very beginning and the very end, you tend to hold on more clearly, and it's more salient memory, and the middle often gets lost. So when you have this huge, big, session, the end you remember at the beginning, but there's a bigger and bigger middle, you're going to lose more and more of that information. So essentially, the more you put in, things do get squeezed out without giving the brain a break. The brain needs a break, needs time to process, times to press reset. And so part of it, even like there's evidence that when you're going to school and you have, let's say, 7 classes, typically, and you ask, what was your day like? What do you remember? What you did first is going to be more, more salient, and also what you did last. And often the middle things, aren't as powerful. But the other thing that's interesting is the idea of interference builds up, especially when you're doing the same topic. So if I'm learning history and I'm going to do it for 5 hours, I'm going to start squeezing things out. The brain is much better if I have an hour of history than an hour of English, than an hour of math, an hour of history again. That 2-hour break when I wasn't doing history lets my brain reset, lets my history brain relax, put things away, consolidate things into memory, organize them, then come back to them. And I'm going to retain that a lot better than just doing history. So that's a really important thing that we teach our students and really focus on. It's called interleaving subjects. There's evidence showing the efficacy of that kind of approach. Okay, next slide. And then the other thing is, taking breaks is essential. And we insist that all of our students take breaks in a smart way. Don't just try to power through things. We use timers. We have our kids do a break after 30 minutes or after an hour, depending upon your own attention span and your ability to focus. And the best kind of breaks are ones that are not going to be cognitively demanding. I would love for students to go for a walk or to stretch or to play a song, do something besides doing cognitive tasks. But for some kids, they're going to go and play a quick game. They're going to go and do a few chats with their friends or snaps or Instagram, whatever that they're doing. Then they can come back, which is fine as well. I'm hip, John. I see you laughing. But in the grand scheme of things, any break is good. But when you go for a walk and your brain can really clear, that's better because it lets the glucose replenish in your brain. It lets your synapses replenish after they've been firing when you're really working heavy. So breaks are essential. Next slide. Okay. And the amount of stimulation is meaningful as well. I think it's important that you get the right level. There are people, in terms of sensory processing and sensory input, that get overwhelmed with too much information. I was having a talk with my friend today, actually, and both him and I have relatively small, filters. So if there's too much happening visually, our IQ drops. If there's too much even happening sonically, auditorily, like if there is a clock that's ticking, it takes so much of my energy to inhibit my attention, my focus on that clock, that I become dumber as well. So too much visual stimulation, I lose some IQ points. Too much auditory stimulation, I lose some IQ points. So for me, the environment is really important for me to focus. And I use chewing gum, I play music, that's certain kinds of music. That's, I've heard 1,000 times. I drink tea, and I'm in otherwise a pretty quiet space. If there's other things happening or conversations, I can't focus as well. So being very mindful about the environment and, so some people, again, their filters are very different. They can be in a crowded bus station and they can learn beautifully and brilliantly. They can inhibit things and takes them very little energy. Someone else with a different brain it takes them much more resources to inhibit those distractions. So it's just knowing yourself, knowing your brain, knowing how you learn, and making sure you set yourself up for success in that regard. And know, just, one of the key things is know what you need. Know what, and so the more you know yourself, you're going to be a better learner in middle school, in high school, in college. And as your self-awareness keeps growing, you're going to become more and more effective as a student. All right, John.
Cool. Yeah. So now that we've got all that, and thank you, Jed, I think that was really helpful for myself too, to remind myself of things. Now I want to talk about, what does it mean to be a good learner? What does it look like? And how do we help ourselves and our students grow? And so a good learner is a self-regulated learner. And so let's define that and understand that. A self-regulated learner is able to recognize what's working for them, metacognitively look down at their processes that they're using and reflect on them and edit them to continue to grow, right? So you're being proactively selective about what you're focusing on. You're organizing things to have an advantage to process through them correctly. And then you're able to reflect back and say, like, that didn't work as well as I wanted to. How can I do that more effectively in the future? So how do you become a self-regulated learner? That's a great question. I think that it's a continual growth process that we all look at and work towards as we grow. Even now at my age, I still am looking at how do I continue to grow and become better at this, right? And even my son's age, who's 6, building that process as we can, where we're at with the skill sets, is important too. And so the first step is focusing on finding the most efficient ways you can learn. What are the processes that work the best for you? And then assessing what is working inside of that and what is not working inside of that. And a lot of that is stopping after doing a task, like we said earlier with like the Pomodoro technique, taking 25 minutes to do a task and then taking 5 minutes to break, but then also taking a few more minutes to reflect and say, like, how was that harder than I expected it to be? How focused was I? How can I be more focused next time? How can I take and retain this information? Because like Jed said, having multiple interactions with it will become better for us. And so my favorite word, that idea of metacognition, how do we reflect back on how much do we know? One of the biggest struggles that students have is they often, students being anyone of any age, humans, will overestimate how much they know about something. So I've got a student right now, and one of his biggest struggles, one of the things that we're working with consistently is, if we look over some material, he can look it over visually, just like processing it with his eyes, and he can repeat back to me all the big important things right away. And so the fact that he can give it to you right away makes him feel like he can retain it forever. But that's not true at all. Like within 15 minutes, he has forgotten most of the stuff that we've talked about in that short chunking period. If he doesn't do anything else with it, if he's just visually processing it, it's not good enough for him and it's not retaining. Students who struggle with this metacognitive thought process overestimate their ability to retain, and students who are good at this will underestimate their ability and think, I need to be better. How do I grow this? How do I continue this process? The best way to figure it out is forced retrieval. So putting some sort of testing environment up, putting questions up and having to make choices on what the right answers are, whether it be actual real tests or like a practice test. Any sort of those scenarios like that are going to help us get comfortable with where are we actually landing with this stuff. I was meeting with a student earlier tonight, working on the SAT, and he's scoring very, very high on the SAT, close to perfect. But his worry is, I don't know enough. I'm not ready enough yet for this. What if I can't score at this level on the day of the test, despite having the fact that I've done this a couple of times in a row, scored it at this level on practice tests? And so helping that metacognitive side of like owning what you've done, feeling comfortable with the process you had, but also looking at like, where are the little places we can tweak and make it better, is always really important. So testing comes in many forms. It could be an actual sitting down and taking something that looks similar to the test that you're prepping for school. It could be a form of teaching somebody else. So if that's a world of like the student talking to their parents or talking to their friends, trying to impart the information, that is a really handy way to do it. Similarly, how I'm doing for you guys right now, like talking through the process of this helps me retain the process of this more. It also helps you guys learn. So it's like a benefit for everybody. Asking yourself somebody else questions, studying with flashcards, using divided notes, doing some verbal walkthroughs of things. All those pieces of the puzzle can be good testing environment moments. But after doing those, like we said earlier, being able to stop metacognitively step back and make cognitive adjustments of what worked well for me there in that studying process. What do I still not retain? What's another way to look at that information I'm retaining? Similarly here, like I'm bored and frustrated with this book. I need to do something else. I can't focus on reading these same lines over and over again. It's not processing for me. How do I step away from it, or whatever it be? So very basic strategies that students often use when you talk to a student, you say like, well, how did you study for this test? Their answer is often things like, well, I read the chapters again, or I looked over my notes. I looked up unknown words that I didn't know, like very simple ideas like that. But more advanced strategies, the strategies that help, like Jed said earlier, retain information longer, connect those synapses together so that the 3 days later they can pull it back up on a test and apply it correctly, are taking the ideas, turning them into their own understandings, both visually, through drawing on background knowledge, visualizing events in the text, connecting bigger ideas between each other from different chapters of the text, figuring out where you're going with the information ahead of time, and then watching and making sure you follow each of the logic leaps of the process before it. So one of the things that I highly encourage students to do, and I like to do for myself when I'm learning new information, is set a goal for what do I want to be after I finish this? What do I want to learn as I go into this information? And then I go do the information, and then I take a moment to reflect and say, like, did I get what I needed from this? Can I answer this question better now? Do I understand this topic better now? If not, what do I need to do differently the next time I study it? The other important thing is like, how do you tie in old information and new information, right? So like every study time period is not focused just on the idea that you studied right now. It's tying it back to, like in history, like previous pieces of information that you've been learning about, or math class, tying it to like earlier like formulas and ideas, and how does like, the unit circle relate to Pythagorean theorem, and all those fun pieces of the puzzle that go together like that. One of the things that when working with students on with flashcards is helping them understand how to use flashcards effectively, right? So this fits in pretty well right here. A lot of people, when they do flashcards, they just have a flashcard of like the topic and the terminology, and they just run through a bunch of them again and again and again, and just the visualization of looking at them, they're hoping works. But like we said earlier, that process itself isn't going to get you where you need to be. And so a better process is, as you go through your flashcards, have 3 different piles that you're working on. One is things that I know, and things that I know are things that like I can give you the answer on the back right there when I see the word. I have that thing down. I'm good to go with it. I can move on from it. Move those guys out of your pile. Focus your pile on the things I sort of know, which are the things that you're like, oh yeah, what is that? That's sort of like, how does those things relate? And you're starting to visualize the back of that card, and you're starting to visualize how where it was on a list when you first wrote it down, or those pieces of the puzzle. And then things where I don't know that at all. Those 2 things should live together, and you should be working through those sets. And you should never take a flashcard out of your set rotation until you can, snap of the finger, give the definition of it 3 different times on 3 different occasions. If you've been able to do that, like, Monday morning at 8 a.m., Monday evening at 6 p.m., and Tuesday at 4 p.m., if you can do it there's 3 different times just like that, then you've got it down. Then we can move away from it. We can just focus on the stuff we need. At some point, you should bring it all back, like 3 or 4 days later, and make sure that all those things you thought you knew are still retaining. But in the terms of processing and building a better system, that can be a really handy tool for everybody. And similarly, we kind of hit this point already, but I want to make sure we really fine tune it right, is that as we're learning information, being able to step back and reflect on it. What were my takeaways for this? Why was the author writing it? What was the point? What was the goal of this? What are the key things that matter to me in this thing? What was the hardest to follow? What was the easiest to follow? Those pieces are important too. And one of the things I encourage students to do is, if you ever hit a wall where you're reading and there's like a paragraph where you're just like, I don't understand what this is saying at all. Recognizing that paragraph is probably going to be important later, and marking or making some sort of notation, a sticky note, whatever it be, to say like, I need to come back to this and reprocess it in 24 hours in a place where my brain can think in a different way about it. I need to flush out where my brain is right now and come back with a new thought process. And I think Jed's hit this one important too as well, but having that specific space where you're studying. I have so many students who say like, I study in bed. And the danger of that is your bed's designed for you to sleep in, and your brain is being reminded, hey, this is the place where I sleep, every time you're sitting in it trying to do work. Please don't study in your bed. Find a different place, a place that's devoted to the study process, whether that be its own room, but whatever it be, it needs to be a place where the focus is on the studying. Because when you sit in a certain environment, your brain reacts to, what do I do in that environment, right? When we sit on the couch, we start slouching and prepare for like watching TV or reading a book or something. When we go to the dining room table, we all of a sudden start feeling hungrier because we're sitting down to eat regularly where we eat, right? Those pieces of the puzzle are connecting in our brain and clicking, and we need to make use of them to help reinforce. And then the organizational side of it is really important too. I think that a lot of people struggle with, like, I've got stuff I have to do today, but I don't know what it is. I don't know what order I should do it. I don't know how long it's going to take. And so a lot of what I encourage people to do is, instead of just, putting their mass pile of stuff on their desk and sort of taking it as it goes, sit down and make their action plan. What are the things that I have to do today? What are the things due tomorrow? What are the things due the rest of this week? What's the big project coming up down the ladder? How long is each thing going to take? Because then I can decide, what are the things that have to be conquered today? What are the top priority things? What are the, if I have time, things? And what are the, I have to make sure that I fit this in somewhere in my life this week things, because I can't do it today. I don't have enough time, but it can't wait until next week. So it has to have some point when I come back to it. So like we said, right, building out the plan, figuring out what you're going to do when you sit down to study, and also recognizing that you're just not going to study for 8 hours straight. No one can do that. Like, we feel like we did study for 8 hours straight, but honestly, if we could track how long we were off task, it was a fair amount of that time, and maybe half that time that we were off task at the end of the day. So building in plans for where you're having those breaks, recognizing that we're human, we need those breaks. We need food, we need nourishment back in our bodies. All those pieces of the puzzle are important. Here's an example of a study schedule I built with a student once, trying to plan out, well, what does my Saturday look like in terms of getting ready for all the stuff that I have to do. So there's time in here for doing my normal routine before I sit down. There's certain periods that I'm going to be working on in certain orders, but there's also a nice, 15 minutes in between for me to be able to do other things and to refocus and to get my energy back, like Jed was talking about. Go for a walk, exercise, do a guided meditation, do a journal, all the important stuff that helps round you out and help you recognize that life isn't just school. And like we said, I think we hit this one, right? Making sure that you are both taking care of yourself mentally, but also taking care of yourself big picture, because if you just sit down and you spend 8 hours a day, every day doing homework, you're going to burn yourself out and not feel successful. And so how can we make it more quality instead of the quantity of it? So yeah, I think we've got a good piece of those puzzles. We also, just a real quick version of Cornell Notes, if you haven't heard of it, is a great way to like take charge of your notes that you're taking in school. So the world of Cornell Notes is that you're writing your notes in the main section of a, what are these things called? Lined ruled paper, where at the end of it, after class is over, when you're going back and reflecting, you take the cues section to rewrite your main ideas, to help yourself plan out how you can use this to study. And then you take the bottom of it to make yourself a note on, like, what are the key takeaways or the summaries, things that I could return back to help me remember. So the idea of Cornell Notes is it encourages you to return back and re-paraphrase and reprocess the information as you're taking it. Because the struggle with a lot of students is they'll write down the notes as the class goes, but they'll never look back on it until the day before the test. And then it doesn't mean anything to them. And so having an opportunity to spend 15, 20 minutes to reprocess the notes from the day to be successful long-term really helps connect those synapses. And we've, heard these ideas before, that we as humans learn in multiple ways. We learn auditorily, which means we learn by hearing, which is why you guys are listening to me talk. We learn visually, which is why we're also looking at a PowerPoint and not just my smiling face as we learn, but we learn kinesthetically, which is why I encourage you guys to write down your thoughts, to put your own actions down, to paraphrase what we're saying and presenting to you guys in a way to help retain. And the key thing that I stress to students is that you learn best by mixing those things together, by using all three of these learning processes. You're not going to learn best just by hearing things. You'll learn best by hearing things and writing things down and looking at information. So take opportunities to use all those together at the same time. And then lastly, we have hit this, but I love to stress it because I think it's super important, is that the best way to retain information is by taking it from another person's words and putting it into your own. right? So a source text says the need for investors to earn a commercial return may put upward pressure on prices. And our paraphrase is the need for profit is likely to push up prices. We understand it better because we have decided what we think those words mean instead of just repeating and not processing through the original source text. All right, Jed, you're back up. We'll let you take over the next little bit.
Excellent. Thank you, John. So the next part is going to be about optimizing retention. And retention matters a heck of a lot. Can I retrieve things? Can I hold them in memory? And when I need them, they're going to be there for me. And a very important thing has to do with how we process information. And when we have lots of interruptions, when we have to do task switching between things, when we get a ping on our phone, there's a notification, something comes up. Every time that happens, it's going to degrade the quality of how we process information. It's making everything more shallow. We're going to have a harder time retrieving it later on. We don't know it as deeply. So whenever you're learning something and you're constantly, someone's like throwing things at you, it's going to dramatically impact your ability to recall that later. And so every interruption takes time to get back. Some people, they can do it pretty quickly, a couple minutes, 3 minutes, 5 minutes. I've heard, different research. There are only about 2% of people in the country who've been, in studies who actually can do several things parallel without degrading either or both of those tasks. These are called the supertaskers, and they are rare. So everyone tries to multitask, and we think we're doing okay at it. We're kind of sharing attention. The brain can't share attention for most of it. The brain's playing ping pong. I'm here, then I'm not here. Then I'm here, then not here. And every time you pull away, you're missing whatever's happening. You're trying to catch up. So people who believe I can do both well, 2 out of 100 can. But honestly, it's the whole thing of our sense of accuracy is really not great here. It's like, if you ask a room full of people, how many of you are above average drivers? And, 9 in 10 people raise their hand. It's like, well, that's not right. How many of you can multitask? Most, you'll have more than 2% of people raise their hand. But the evidence shows otherwise. So task switching is really terrible for any kind of deep work or any kind of long-term memory work. All right, next slide, please. So one thing that's interesting, there's some research out there that, again, every time, you're trying to tell your brain this matters, don't forget this. And so one thing that's interesting is when you change context and you review information. I review it in the library. Then I review it in my room. Then I go and I review it in study hall. Then every time you have a contextual change, you lay down the information in a slightly different way. It's embedding itself deeper and deeper in the brain to other networks. It's like, oh, this information is coming in here. It's tying to bedroom. Oh, it's tying to outside on, on the hammock. It's tying to, it's like, oh, this thing must really matter. And it keeps laying itself down deeper and deeper. So every time you have a contextual change in terms of where you're learning and and with whom, it actually embeds deeper. So that's an interesting thing if you're trying to learn it, because you're telling your brain this matters in all contexts. So the brain's like, okay, got it. This is important everywhere. We'll keep it deeper. Next up. So I mentioned to you there's ample research out there in terms of blocking versus mixing up practice. So is it better for me to do 3 hours of chemistry, 3 hours of math, there's history, or an hour change, an hour change, an hour change? And what's interesting is when you pack things together, and then during practice, let's say you do 3 hours of chemistry, and then I throw at you a chemistry series of questions. Well, after 3 hours straight, in that moment, you're going to be more accurate when you're blocking it. And if I'm having you do an hour, then 2 hours off, then an hour, you're not going to be as accurate. However, when you come back a week later and test them for accuracy, you can see here the evidence on the right side with the mixers, those who shook it up, who had 3 different intervals with interference in between, they have a much higher rate of recall and accuracy versus those who did big blocks. Their recollections are much less accurate. And that slide to me is really powerful. And see, and so part of it during practice, you have this confidence that, wow, I really got this. I really know it during this practice, but you haven't walked away from it and come back to it. That's really the true test. Do you know it once you've walked away from it? And that forgetting moment and then relearning it, that relearning really sinks it in more than just getting more comfortable through one long session. So again, evidence, we use it, it informs our practice. Next slide. The other thing, talking I was working like John. I also see a number of students. I coach them for executive functioning, and I talk about sleep all the time with my kids because sleep is a huge part of memory consolidation. One of my students was getting up in the morning at 5:30. He was going into work out in the gym with a couple of friends, but then it was affecting him later on in the day, and he was getting tired. And when the nights when he went to bed and woke up at 5:30, he was getting about 6 hours of sleep, and this kid needs about 8, and he knows it. And he was catching up on the off days, but still globally over the course of the week, he wasn't getting enough sleep. And then on the weekends, he wanted to be social and didn't want to go to bed early. He wanted to see his friends. He's a sophomore in high school. So part of it is, how do we change this? How do we work with this? And he ended up shifting this week to doing his workouts after school. And then he finds actually going to the gym, going to the Y before his homework gives him a little bit of boost mentally versus coming home and feeling tired. And so self-care, sleep it's so important. And also we have all this evidence now of how memory consolidates during sleep. And the hippocampus, which is one of the primary organs, for memory consolidation, it's taking things in, and then it feeds it to the cortex for long-term storage. But at night, when you have a certain pattern that you took in during the day, the hippocampus plays it on loop again and again and again, like 100 times really fast, and then it embeds it in the cortex. So the hippocampus is just waiting to get good, proper sleep. If you don't give it that, things are not going to be reinforced and then locked into long-term memory. So we need that time and regular sleep schedule. People who do like shift work and they change when they sleep, have very bad sleep hygiene, it dramatically impairs retention and long-term recall. So you need a consistent sleep schedule. It really is powerful. Next slide, Jen, thanks. So we mentioned before about the Ebbinghaus curve. And if you want to remember things, you want to space things out. And if you want to remember them for a long time, you can begin to increase the intervals between sessions. So if I want to remember things in 3 months, it's better for me to, do it, learn information, review it the next day, then in 3 days, then in 7 days. And as you get longer and longer, and still you reinforce it, the brain's like, oh, this really must be meaningful to me, versus if I'm going to do 3 sessions, like, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, if I'm trying to recall it for 2 months for an AP exam, I'll actually want to space it out a little bit longer, and the brain's getting the signal, this really matters. Don't forget it for a long time. Okay, next slide. Then there's some research here. This is Hattie's work. He did this massive meta-analysis of like thousands of studies and looking at what matters for learning and retention. And interestingly enough, a lot of things that we do that aren't that helpful, like when we summarize things, not that useful for long-term retention and memory transfer. Highlighting things, it's pretty passive. There isn't much of a gain by doing highlighting. I still do it because it's fun. And it's like my hand has something to do, but it's, it's like a pleasure. And if I'm going back to like record my notes, it's useful, but I'm not learning any better by highlighting. I'm using, rereading. And that's something I've seen so many of my students spend so much more time reading things again. And I have a test coming up. Let me read it 4 times. I'm like, do not read it 4 times. Read it 1 time. But then I want you to work with that information because rereading is passive. You're not interacting with it. You're not struggling with it. You're not getting feedback. Am I right or wrong? Do I know this yet? You're not getting, and the feedback is essential. But what does show real evidence and real strength, practice testing, making yourself, and there are 1,000 ways to test yourself using Quizlet or flashcards or asking questions. Do I know this? That's how you get feedback. And the very act of recalling something changes the way it's encoded into memory. It makes it a more durable encoding when I forcibly retrieve it without unaided recall, uncued. Next up, distributed practice. Oh, I'm sorry, John. When you, I shouldn't, that's a word I shouldn't use very often. Down this list, distributed practice, when I spread things out over time, it shows a high utility, a huge, strong evidence space, a big effect size that you learn more effectively, you retain things more when you spread things out over time versus massing. This is a very prominent effect in literature. And then finally, interleaving practice. There's good results for this. It's not as strong as practice testing, but when I do chemistry, then math, history, back to chemistry, that's called interleaving. That's more powerful than blocking. Okay, next slide. All right. And I mentioned ever so briefly in terms of rereading, it's fairly passive. There's no feedback and there's no struggle. Reading it again, and you need struggle. You need, there's a concept called desirable difficulties. that you learn the best when there's some challenge. And there's been research on this, even something as simple as giving students a font that's kind of hard to read, a little bit grainy or low contrast. And the act of struggling to read this makes them retain it better. When the brain's having to work, it actually changes how things encode when I'm struggling some. And so you have to have errors. It's called errorful learning. And if you're not getting feedback and realizing, then it's no good. So similarly, when you're learning from this, like if John gave you the perfect copy of this document, you honestly haven't done much struggling or grappling with it. Getting a perfect copy of anything is not great for learning. So when you get everything a word for word copy, you haven't learned much. That's why course stenographers, they get every single word down perfectly. Then you ask them, what did you hear? And there's blank. They have no idea. But they got, their task was getting the words down right. So what's important is more active engagement interaction. So maybe I'm hearing 100 words, but I'm writing down 10. I'm choosing 10. I'm putting a star by this word. This matters. So I'm an arrow to here. That's when I'm interacting with it. I'm working with it. I'm generating material. And it's not passive. That's when I'm learning. When I'm creating, generating, interacting, processing, struggling, that's learning, not passive anything. Next slide. And one of the things I think about this is like when I hear a podcast, I play them all the time. I really learn it when I go and talk to my wife and explain it to her. When I mansplain the podcast, or I talk to my friend and I explain to him what I learned. And so to me, I love teaching, but part of it, through teaching, I learn. Through teaching, I retain. And there's all this research. One of my colleagues, Sherry Oberon's got a PhD with me, and her research was on peer tutoring. And it's so interesting that there's everywhere you look, there are peer tutoring programs of peer-to-peer. The ones who benefit are the ones who are the more advanced, stronger peer. There's all the research. It's very clear, and it's a little bit disheartening if your kid's going to peer tutoring. But if your kid is the better, the more advanced of the two, he's getting more bang for the buck, or she's getting more bang for the buck and learning better. So by teaching, we learn. And so that's versus just passively hearing it, I'm not really learning very much. And so ways to rehearse, I could teach someone else. I could teach my cat. I could teach the wall. I could go, and when I was getting ready for my doctoral thesis, I would use my iPhone and I would just record myself talking. And I would go through my comps questions again and again, but I was generating, recalling, retrieving. It wasn't passive. I was doing unaided recall. And that really helped me anchor it and learn it. Study guides, where I'm drawing them, I'm making concept maps, I'm outlining things, I'm actively engaging, writing. There's a history question in an AP World, and I'm doing pros and cons, looking at the early civilizations, back and forth, answering questions. And anytime you're working, struggling, that's when you're learning. Next slide. In long-term projects, I work with kids on this stuff. So does John. Spelling things out, spreading things out. So this is kind of a little different than memory, but actually working with kids with their calendars, structuring out when different parts are going to be due. And so they aren't ever overwhelmed. I'm working now with kids in college, and they have longer term assignments. So, okay, we're going to have the outline here, get research here, and it goes in their calendar they're using over time. So it's not all at once. It's kind of a different talk a little bit, but important as well. Next slide. And then teachers, learning how to work with your teachers, especially our students who are struggling. John and I both have had students who are failing, and part of it, or just fully falling behind, and learning that your teachers are incredibly important. How to work with them, how to interact with them, how to self-advocate when you're behind. I had a student who was having a hard time, understanding the homework. He had a teacher with a really strong accent, and he was actually failing some assignments. And part of it is you have to support yourself. And now he goes and has her write things down for him. It's like getting the help you need and learning how to speak up for yourself versus just shrugging your shoulders. And I've seen some students just, this is how it is, but you have to learn how to take care of yourself. And this is a major skill. And so we teach this too. So work with your teachers, and it's really important. Next slide. And finally, in broader than just your teachers, help seeking, learning how to get help. It's a major thing in terms of metacognition, of self-directed learning, as John mentioned, is knowing I need more support. I'm not getting this. I need some, and then learning that, and also studying at certain times when you're going to be able to go get help versus I'm reviewing it Thursday night, the test is Friday, now it's too late. Versus reviewing it on Wednesday, I can go in and talk to the teacher on Thursday, study hall, talk to a friend, a peer, get some help, go on the internet, whatever it is. So not waiting until it's too late to actually get the help that you need. So help seeking, self-advocacy, huge skill. Females are better at this on average. This is plenty of research. Carol Dweck, Mark Seligman out of UPenn did this research. And part of it, guys often need some encouragement of how to self-advocate. And that's what we do. That's our work too. All right, next up, John.
There's my mute. All right, cool. Last little bit for you guys. Talking to parents now, right? Talking to parents and students together. How do we work together in this world to be successful? One of them is that as parents, I know for a fact that it's very hard to give feedback in a way that is accepted by a student, right? And so thinking about how do we have that conversation effectively? There's the fun method of the praise sandwich, which some people like and some people don't. But the idea there is that when I have something constructive to give, I want to make sure that they don't just hear the negative side of it, and we provide positivity, we provide things that we're excited about, things that we're proud of that they're doing currently, and then show the thing that we think they could grow it better at, right? And then finish up with something positive as well. The processing, I think, is important like that. But also bringing up, like, I'd like to talk to you about this. When is a good time for us to do that? When are you going to be ready for that conversation? Instead of, I'm going to give you this conversation right now, whether you're ready for it or not, probably the response is going to be, I don't want this right now. I don't want to hear this from you. Please go away. And then probably not as nice of a way. So having conversations about when is the right time for the feedback. Another piece is recognizing the forest and the trees, right? So the forest is where we've been big picture, and the trees are each of the steps along the process. Sometimes as a parent, it's hard to see, that how far we've gone because we see how far the forest is. And sometimes as a student, it feels like I've got so much more to do. But stopping and reflecting on, like, how much better are you at each of the steps of each of the growths that you've done? Where are these successes that you've had so far? Even if there are going to be failures, and there will be failures, right? There are things that don't work as well as we wanted them to. Can we see the success moments? And can we reflect and celebrate the success together? Right. So like I said, recognizing those growth mindset moments, recognizing those moments where we saw a struggle and we looked at a way to continue to grow from that struggle instead of reacting like, oh no, I can't do this because I failed at once type moments. Those are important too. Encouraging students to be interested and receptive to what works for them. So talking with them, like I said earlier, like having a time where we can sit down and have a conversation. Is dinner time tonight a good time for us, or maybe dinner time tomorrow night? Or like, what's a time for us to sit down and say, like, what's going well? What's successful? What are we proud of? Encouraging them to have their own autonomy in that process. What are you doing to be successful, and how do you think it's going for you? Students who know what they are good at are often better off than those who only know what they are bad at. I really like that statement. I think that that's important. And also, I think it's important to recognize that the world is what it is. There's always something going on that makes you feel like there are problems, there's overwhelming. I don't know how to process through things, right? And as students, they're learning about the world and they're learning about their place in the world. And so there will probably be moments where they feel overwhelmed and stressed, and it's okay to take mental health days. It's okay to step back for a minute. We shouldn't expect our students to be perfect every day, all day, nonstop, nor should we expect that from ourselves. And so helping recognize, like, it's okay. I know that today was a hard day. It's okay to take a step back. Let's look at it tomorrow and see if there's another way to approach it. So I encourage everyone to make a commitment with your family members to try new strategies. One of the things that I stress is very important is that if you're trying something new, if you're trying a new location to study, if you're trying a new process to study, you're trying the Pomodoro technique, whatever it be, trying the new flashcard methods, it's going to feel not like it's working right at first. You're going to feel like, oh, I don't like this. It's harder. It's weirder. I want to go back to the way it was before. It takes 20 days of repetitive process for you to get comfortable with the process, whether that be trying a new diet, going to the gym, learning to use the Pomodoro technique, right? Having those conversations with your parents about how things are going. All those things you're not going to like for about 20 days. And then finally, you're going to feel like, okay, cool, this is the process that it is. And then it starts working. So be aware of that. Allow for the fact that we can revisit it and say, like, well, what's still not working after 20 days? But give yourself a commitment to try something out more than just a day or two. That's going to help a lot. All right. Well, that is our fun topic tonight. Thank you all so much. We've got a few minutes for questions. Please feel free to chat them in the question and answer box. We've got a couple in there already. We'll make sure to answer. But our last little bits, don't forget of our fun stuff on social media. Please feel free to follow us. We'll keep you up to date what's happening in the world of college admissions testing and everything inside of the Operative world. We do all sorts of services, SAT, ACT, we do subject prep, we do AP prep. If you're struggling with high school subject assistance, or if you need study skills or executive functioning coaching, we're here to help. And then please make sure to check out our EF skills quiz at learn.operative.com/EF skills quiz. You can also just go to operative.com. At the top, there is the executive functioning option. And inside there, you can find the quiz there too.
And,
all right. So
now maybe a good time also just to have everyone do a quick poll. Some
Yeah.
of you today may need a little bit of help. And if any of you want any assistance or want any information about anything, click one of these things. And then that's it. That's a quick little poll. All right. And now we have time for Q&A. So let's begin. Go ahead and type your questions in there. We have one question already loaded up. And the first question was, is there a rhythm for studying? If you want to get an A on a final exam, that's cumulative. So it's going to be building up over the course of a semester. And in terms of review, you want to begin. One of the key things is, the day after you have a class, doing a quick little review is nice. But then you want to begin to build. You want to begin to build and like see things more than one time. You don't want to review it once and put it away. And so part of it, can I do a more cursory quick review even at the end of the week, where I kind of go back and quickly review things I'd seen that week. And then if maybe I spend 15 minutes reviewing that week, then a week later, or week two, I'm going to review the previous week for 15 minutes, but then do a 5-minute review of the first week. And then things keep adding and shrinking. So I'm still getting lots of intervals. You want to keep intervals up, but you can do less and less time over time. So the more rounds you see it, and this will vary, by the class, how hard the class is. In certain weeks, you may spend a lot more time, and it may require a lot more to really review it and understand it. But you keep touching it, like 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times, it's going to eventually really get in there and be very durable with that many traces of memory. That's kind of a thought. So keep reviewing it and building upon that towards that final exam. Okay. Next question. How do you motivate a student who is not motivated to do schoolwork? John.
Yeah, I mean, this is a great question. I think that the bad answer to this question is we have to find the thing that motivates them. What is the thing that gets them excited? And then how do we make a relation between the thing that they have to do today that they don't see any relation to their excitement to the thing that does get them excited? I have a student right now who wants to be a forest ranger. That's his goal in life. And so he doesn't understand why the classes he's taking in school right now have anything to do with helping him with that. Right. And so a lot of it is like, yeah, I don't see why learning, this history lesson or learning this math equation helps me long-term to become a forest ranger. But we can see how like the process of getting through school is a necessary step to become a forest ranger. And like, what are the steps that you have to do to get through school? Or we can look to see if there's a way to tie in that math idea to being a forest ranger. I don't know too much about being a forest ranger myself. Never been one. So like, making some connections, finding ways to find the thing that excites them and connect it to school, right? We've heard very like easy, simple ways of like, oh yeah, Minecraft's really cool because it's like geometry, but that feels like super boring and easy and doesn't really answer the question of like, that doesn't help you solve geometry, but helping really find ways to make it more entertaining and make it more connecting would be my answer there.
I'll take it. All right. Now, how do study skills needs most typically evolve from middle school to high school? How can I best support my child who has just started in high school and is very aware that the expectations are not those during middle school? That's a big question, a big point of transition. John and I both work with kids who've made that leap. And then from high school to college, we both made that leap as well, where there are very different things in terms of self-regulation and so forth. So when it comes to that evolution, the workload is going to increase. There's a big jump from elementary to middle. That's a big step up in terms of now you have homework. And then the kind of classes, the amount of academic rigor, the amount of reading, everything starts ratcheting up. And there's like a 9th grade pop, and then there's a junior year pop when you start hitting those AP classes and things where suddenly it's an hour of work for that class a night. And then students have to make that adjustment. And so I think the skills have to do with being more efficient knowing, what's important for a teacher, what's irrelevant. I have a teacher right now, is a sophomore, and his AP World teacher keeps distracting them in class and giving them stuff that's not at all on being assessed. And he's spending all this time, like, I want you to read this thing, we'll cover it, but it's not on the quizzes or tests. Like, what are we doing? And part of it's being able to distinguish, this matters. This is not, this is meaningful. This is not meaningful. And that becomes even more important as later in high school and in college. I'm getting a sense of, where my energy will have the biggest return in terms of learning. So it's learning how to distinguish relevant, irrelevant content, organization, and also studying things, over a longer time. There's more material, and projects do get more longer, bigger projects. A 5-page paper versus a 2-page paper in middle school. And so you need more time to edit, more time to review, get your, how to outline things. And so to best support your student, I think talk about the challenges as they come. John and I both, like, we do these check-ins, and like we ask our students, what's our biggest challenge for the week? What's going on? What are you most concerned about? And help students are, they're honest with us typically. And they're going to talk about, I'm having a hard time with this class, and here's why, and here's the teacher delivers the material, here's what I'm struggling with. And you can start, and get them talking. Do more listening with your kids when it comes to this. Assume less and let them really fill in the gaps. And then don't jump in with immediate fixes or solutions or answers. And that's a thing that we all have to work on as EF coaches, as parents. You want to build an autonomous, capable, independent, thoughtful young person. And so if we just go and fix it for them, we haven't built a capacity or a strength or a skill. We gave them an answer, but we're not always going to be there. And the name of the game is building capacity. So my thing is engaging them in dialogue and what are some ideas versus, bam, here's your challenge. Oh, here's the answer. Because also what worked for you and what worked for their older sibling may not totally work for them. And they're gonna have to find a solution that really does work for them. John, other thoughts on that one? Middle school?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing probably from the middle school to high school aspect is understanding, because your workload's increased, how you're going to space out your workload. So it's sort of like I was talking about, like, not only do you have these 3 things you have to do today, how much time is it going to take? What's the right order to take to do them? And when during the day am I going to do them? Right. Because I've definitely have some students who are transitioning, who are 8th grade right now, moving into 9th grade, or were in 8th, I guess now moving into 9th grade, who the struggle is, like, I want to get home from school, I want to eat some food, I want to watch TV for an hour, then I want to hang out with my friends, and now it's like 7 o'clock and I should start my homework. And the process of that doesn't work anymore the way it used to last year. And so learning, like, where do we space in the homework in a way where we can still feel like we have a social life, still enjoy the things we enjoy, but also make sure we're getting the stuff done. That's probably a big piece of the puzzle, I would imagine.
Yeah. And sequencing, and even understanding, like, the more cognitively demanding tasks, do them earlier. Don't save them. Don't save the hard stuff for 10 o'clock at night. That's when you're really in trouble. You've lost the juice, and like save easier things, repetitive things. But it's learning how to, and also even learning how to use your free periods, learning how to use the time when you're waiting for something, or how to optimize your time. So time management becomes key. Time estimation, as John said, becomes key. Understanding how much time things take, which often kids aren't calibrated on in the beginning. And also understanding that it varies dramatically by subject. That for this, assignment, I'll need an hour for my hard class, but for this one, same page count, but I'll need half the time, or whatever it is. It's really getting a sense of your own personal level of difficulty, and then learning how to up resource. Oftentimes, kids in middle school don't go and need extra help or need extra support. In high school, I see a lot more of that, where I'm getting lost now in this math class. I'm getting lost now in chemistry, all these equations that I wasn't, when I was doing environmental or whatever it is, it wasn't that challenging. Suddenly, things ratchet up. So it's learning how to be better at help seeking. It's also a key thing. All right, 9:04. I think we have exhausted the questions.
Yeah, thank you all so much.
Yeah, so we're going to send you a copy of the recording, a copy of the slides. If you need help with this kind of work, academic work, executive functioning, we're here, support you in that. And thanks for being part of this tonight, everybody. All right.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Have a good night.